Good evening and welcome to our Friday evening monk chat here at Empty Cloud Monastery. Hope that you're all doing well, and we have joining with us here some residents in person. So I hope that wherever you are, whether it be the evening, the morning, nighttime, or the afternoon, or if you're watching this later on after it's already been recorded, I hope that you're doing well and that you have a nice supportive environment to listen to the Buddhist teachings and focus your heart on the Dhamma. And I see a few people joining in. We have HPD, Lydia, Ryan, Joseph, Evgeny, Ryan, again, Cows, Mary, Victoria, Sean, Rebecca, Jayanta, Rick, Bhumika, Yankee. So lots of friends joining. So I hope that you're all doing well. And so at this time, we can go ahead and start just by rendering homage to the Buddha 3 times. And then we can go ahead and start answering any of your Dhamma questions. So if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to leave those in the chat, and then we'll get to those hopefully during the session this evening. Okay, so we can render homage to the Buddha 3 times. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang saranang gacchami. Okay, so we can go ahead and just get started. Hello also to Anna. Thank you, Anna. Hope you're doing well. We can go ahead and get started with the first question, which is actually addressed to Bhante Sudaso, who is not here. But I'll go ahead and answer your question for you, HPD. I hope that that's okay. So please forgive me if you were disappointed that Bhante Sudaso is not here. So HPD asks, can you please speak about the Agamas from Mahayana Buddhism? Are they found anywhere in the Pali Canon? What is the history of them? Also, are suttas like the Vimalakirti Sutta, Prajna Paramita, Samadhi Raja Suttas found anywhere in the Pali Canon? Okay, so good question from HPD. Well, the Agamas you say are from the Mahayana Buddhism. I would maybe just correct a little bit what you said, HPD, because we wouldn't really say that the Agamas are from Mahayana Buddhism, but rather that the Agamas are in, for example, the Chinese canon. So Chinese Buddhism is very broad, right? So the Agamas are practiced by people who practice Mahayana Buddhism, also people who practice, you could include maybe Tantra, which is a form of Mahayana Buddhism, but it's even more specific. So there's many different types of Buddhism within the Chinese canon, and the Agamas are one part of that. So they're more like they're independent collections. And in China, we're very lucky, very fortunate that they got lots of different Buddhist texts and they translated all of them, like all the ones that they got. And most of them, a lot of them we have surviving today. So we're very fortunate that they were very, always very respectful of the Dharma that they received and maintaining that and translating that. So although many people in history and also nowadays maybe don't have that much familiarity with the Agamas, though they are studied and they are read and so on. Although they're less popular, you could say, they still preserve them and they still teach them and they still read them and study them and they still translated them and passed them down, copied them. And then so you say, are they found in the Pali Canon? Well, the Agamas are, you could say, the same, they're a version of the text that we have in the Pali Canon. So the simplest way to kind of describe this is that you have what are called early Buddhist texts, and these are texts which are from the first few hundred years of Buddhism, and they're believed by all traditions to come from the Buddha. So you have different Buddhist texts, and some traditions, they believe that those texts come from the Buddha, but they might disagree with other traditions, right? But there's one group of texts which every school of Buddhism, every Buddhist will agree that they come from the Buddha, and that they're the basic teachings of Buddhism. So they're kind of the common core of all Buddhist traditions. And those are preserved in the Pali Canon, they're preserved in the Chinese Agamas, they're preserved in the Sanskrit translations of the Agamas, they're preserved in other languages also that are found in Central Asia and different areas around India. So you see that the same genre of texts are found in different languages. And in China, they just happen to have a translation of the 4 main collections of Agamas, which correspond also to what we call the 4 Nikayas in Pali. So they're not the exact same text because it was an oral tradition. So when we think of a text, often we're thinking of something that has one author, or maybe a collection of authors, but they're listed. There's a list of names, and then they write something down, right? But that idea of a text is different from the idea of an early Buddhist text. An early Buddhist text is more like a song, right? So, a song can have many different versions. It might have different musical accompaniments, and you might even change a little bit how you sing it. You might even simplify the lyrics or add a little bit, but you can still broadly call it's the same song, right? So there's different renditions. You might play it on acoustic guitar. You might play it with a full band. You might play it on piano. You might just sing the song, and it's going to be different every time. So you might say, well, what is the same? Maybe the notes are different. Maybe the lyrics even change. The instruments change. So where is the song? Where is this song? It doesn't seem to have a fixed thing. And then you also, if you try to find an author, maybe it's a very, very old song that's a folk song. It's been passed down through the tradition of a people. You can't really find like, oh, this is the creator. This is the author of the song. It's from a people. It's passed down through many hands, and you can't find one person who wrote it. So that's more like the Buddhist text. They're more like a song. And each tradition, they have their rendition of it. And you can tell, oh, it's the same song. Wow. It's saying the same thing with the same general tone, but it can be a little bit different. And so that's what the Agamas are in relation to the Pali Canon. And then you say, are suttas like the Vimalakirti Sutta, Pratisthana Paramita, Samadhi Raja Suttas, etc., found anywhere in the Pali Canon? And those are not found in the Pali Canon. Those are really more like Sanskrit texts, which were then translated into Tibetan and Chinese and other languages. So those are not found in Pali, but they are found in essentially what we would now consider forms of Mahayana Buddhism. Those are Mahayana Sutras. So they're not part of the Agamas or the Nikayas, but they are found in things like Sanskrit, so other Indian languages. Okay, and then the next question is from Lydia, who says, what do your names mean? That was asked about the new monks this morning, so I wondered about yours. My name is Vadha, and Vadha is actually a name, so it's kind of like Johnny. It doesn't literally mean Johnny, but it's like it's a name of someone. And then in terms of the meaning of it, one of the meanings of Vadha is old, like someone who's old. And it was given to me by Bhante Sudarsana Ayasoma. I heard it when I was 19, so I think there's a little bit of irony there. And then I can also, because you said, what are your names? Bhante Sudasa's name, I'll answer for him because he's not here. Sudha means pure. And asa means an aspiration. So Sudhasa means pure aspiration. So those are our names. Okay, then we have another question from Lydia following that. Says, how do you balance renouncing worldly concerns versus maintenance that needs on such a large place? I have trouble with a much smaller house. Thoughts of maintenance needs creeps into my meditation all the time. Yeah, so how do you balance renouncing the world but also maintaining maintenance, especially on a mansion in West Orange, New Jersey? Right? When I became a monk, I didn't think I'd be moving to a mansion. Technically, I didn't move here. I don't live here technically, but I do stay here from time to time. And how do you balance it? Well, ideally, we as monks, we have as little house management as possible. That's ideal. So that's why, for example, recently we started collaborating with our lay supporters and forming different committees so that they could help organize things like maintenance and different jobs that maybe the monastics were taking care of, which are involve talking and negotiating, with a plumber or with repairs on the building, things like that. So ideally, as monastics, we don't manage a house. That's ideal because the word for a monastic, or when one becomes a monastic, it's called going forth into the homeless life. However, ever since the time of the Buddha, the Sangha has had access to large properties. So the Buddha himself lived in a monastery. He lived in a property which was donated. So it was land that had been donated, and there were buildings on the land. So there were kutis and housing, and the details of it are not maybe the same as the modern details, but however, it was a large property which had buildings on it. And wherever you have property with buildings, you have maintenance. It's just the way of the nature of having a building. It needs to be maintained. So generally speaking, the way we try to manage it is that we try to just turn any kind of obstacles that anything we perceive as an obstacle, anything we perceive as getting in the way of our spiritual practice, we try to integrate it, not creating this fixed duality, but integrating it into our spiritual practice, right? So as a monastic, we try to remove as much as possible so that we can focus as much as possible on our spiritual practice. But when we do encounter worldly concerns, worldly needs, then we say, well, we're part of samsara. The whole practice, Buddhist practice, is understanding the nature of samsara. It's accepting, coming to know the nature of, realizing the workings of our heart within samsara. So that includes building maintenance, as much as we might hate it, right? But that includes it. And so generally speaking, whenever we have these worldly things, we turn them into, how can I turn this into a Dhamma thing, right? So from the wheel of the world into the wheel of Dhamma, how can we turn this and rotate it around so that we turn it into spiritual practice? So maybe we have to do some cleaning, we have to do some kind of repairing. And if we really can't avoid it, if we really can't skillfully avoid it, then hopefully we just say, well, this is part of samsara. And part of samsara is things like having a body, having to have shelter, having to have clothing. So the other day I had to do some repairing on my robe. You might say, well, stitching. When you became a monk, you didn't think you had to do stitching. I heard a story that a monk said that another monk was telling him when he became a monk, he didn't expect that he would have to learn how to sew and how to sing. But you do. You have to learn how to chant and also how to do sewing. So there are certain activities that we have to do. Like we have to maintain our clothing and we also have to maintain our house, wherever we're staying, whether it's a cave, whether it's a hut or under a tree. Even when I was camping in Italy, when we're staying, we're just sleeping under the trees, you still have to do some maintenance. You have to move around some leaves. You have to make a little spot. Sometimes you have to readjust the tent. Sometimes there's rain or you have to dry it out. So it happens wherever we are. And so we just kind of try to turn it into our Dhamma practice as much as possible. And then when you're doing meditation, you say thoughts creep into your meditation about maintenance. Ideally, what you do is you try to build a safe place. Try to build a quiet time. And when you're meditating, we just give ourselves permission to meditate. So when we meditate, we want to give ourselves permission to let go of the past, to let go of the future, and to not be commenting on the present. So personally, I repeat that quite a lot whenever I'm guiding a meditation or anything like that. And also to myself, I remind myself of that whenever I'm meditating. So when we're meditating, we try to free ourselves of the burden of the past. We're constantly carrying it around with us. And we're also constantly carrying the future. So we have like two shoulders and they're filled, one with the past, one with the future. And then the other in front of our face is filled with our comments about the present. So we don't want to experience the present. We just experience our commentary, experience our opinions, our likes and dislikes, our preferences. And so when we meditate, we try to just give ourselves permission. For now, during this time, I'm going to give myself permission to set down the past and the future. So it just takes practice. We just have to practice and train our mind. And hopefully over repeated practice, repeated habitual, regular practice, your mind can start to understand, now is the time to meditate. The Buddha says that someone who's master of their mind, they think what they want to think when they want to think it. So most of the time, we don't have full control over what we're thinking. But as we practice, it's possible to think what we want to think when we want to think it. And that's what we're training. But it doesn't actually come through controlling. It actually comes through giving permission, giving space to let go. So that's a few thoughts on that matter. And Brian says, greetings from the Peruvian rainforest. Greetings. Saludos. Okay, and we have a question from Joseph. Warmest wishes, Venerables. Warmest wishes to you, Joseph. Hope you're doing well. It says, could you kindly share personal experiences from your lives where you were able to recognize and appreciate the benefits of renunciation? How do you nurture those perceptions? Personal experiences where we're able to recognize and appreciate the benefits of renunciation. Oh, that's a good question. It's hard to answer because as a monk, almost everything we do is about renunciation. Um, it's so part of just our life. But just today, one of the monastics was asking about Tudong and asking about our wandering practice, wandering and just living off of alms. And honestly, even when we're not just living off of alms, even when we're not wandering around, even just the fact of living off of alms and is already kind of very similar to Tudong, especially when I'm in Italy. You're sleeping in the forest, even though you might not be walking from village to village. It's essentially the same thing. You just go back to sleep in the same forest, but you walk to the village and you come back. So it's very similar. And then also even in a monastery, if we really keep in mind the perception of the reality that every single day, it's a miracle that we have food, if we have it. It's a miracle. So every single day we could not have food that day offered. So for me, living off of alms food is really one of the strongest ways of developing the perception of renunciation, renouncing your own sense of independence, renouncing your own sense of buying what you want or what you don't want, so your preferences, renouncing any kind of social preferences. So for example, sometimes people, they perceive you as beggars. Very often they perceive you as beggars, right? They don't perceive you as pleasant people. They perceive you as maybe kind of ruining the beauty of the area because you're just standing there expecting things from people. That's how they perceive it, at least, right? That's not how we should practice, but that's how it's perceived. And so your personal independence, your financial preferences and independence, your social status and your social preferences, how you want to be seen, all of that, you start losing it, right? Wearing a robe, you can't dress yourself up and look how you want. Not being able to shower when you want, not smelling how you want. One time when we were staying, I was with a layperson, and he was staying in the forest with us, and he was really concerned about smelling bad. And I told him, we always smell bad. We just have to get over it. So yeah, sometimes you can't choose exactly how you smell when you're living on generosity. If people don't offer a shower, then you can't take one. So as a monastic, it's really living as an alms mendicant is every single day we're reminded of our renunciation. And then also the beauty of other people. When you live off of alms food, you see the beauty of people, because most of our interactions with people, most of the time, it's when they're cultivating generosity, when they're giving, when they're going out of their way to help and care for someone. It's so beautiful. It's so rare that people do that because they don't have the opportunity all the time to just spontaneously go out of their way to help someone survive that day, to support them. And especially a spiritual practitioner, because when someone cultivates reverence and deference towards spiritual practice, that's also for their long-lasting benefit. It makes an imprint on the mind. And it might inspire them to practice renunciation. It might inspire them to practice more generosity, more kindness, to develop their mind in more peace. So for me, that's just recollecting. And the other thing is, I can still remember very clearly many specific offerings that people made, even though it took maybe just a few seconds of the day, just in a random village or a random spot or a random day at the monastery. I still can remember just the person, how they looked, and what they offered. And yeah, it's so interesting because there's so many things that we don't recognize. Maybe you see so many people during the day, you don't recognize them. But just a few seconds when someone offers just some food, they just support you that little bit, I can still remember. And it's not just me, because sometimes I'll talk to another monastic who was there and I'll say, oh, do you remember that time when that person offered this? And it might even be some kind of bread, which is so common. You get it all the time. And they might remember. They remember, oh yeah, I remember that person, because it sticks in the heart. And then you're reminded of being a renunciate. You're reminded of the importance of practice. You're reminded of the humility that we should be developing. So for me, that's a really helpful perception. Okay. Yes, please.
Yes, I need to leave instructions for my funeral, whenever that is. A Buddhist funeral, which will be attended by almost all people who are not Buddhists in New York City. And I've learned a little bit about the practice, but not so much. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Okay, we just have a question about a Buddhist funeral. Yeah, briefly, what comes to mind is I would talk to the temple or the monastery where you might be planning on, where you think it would be reasonable to have a funeral. Usually, what's done is Buddhist monks might do like a kind of additional part of the funeral. So, for example, the actual processing of the body is usually not done by Buddhists, but you might add. So, for example, you might talk to however you're planning on having the remains actually dealt with, either through a funeral home or some kind of service for that. Then you could find the temple where you're planning on having the monks invited and having them interested in coming, and just talk to them about what they might offer, what they might do for funerals, because it can kind of vary depending on the particular monastery and the particular monastics there. But usually there's just going to be some chanting and recollection of death and things like that. But it's hard to say because specifically what might be done will vary. So I'd recommend finding in the area where the funeral would be, who would be invited, and then just talking to them directly and telling them that you're interested in that. And I'm sure that they'd be happy in supporting a funeral. Usually there's a kind of funny story that there's a monastery in Germany. On their website they say, like, we don't do celebrations of this kind, we don't do this, and the only thing they accept is funeral invitations. Because usually for Buddhists it's like the one type of event that we'll happily do because of the recollection of death and the importance of also sharing merit with the departed and so on. So usually they'll be happy to help support, especially someone who is not born Buddhist and they want to do that. Okay, so we have, let's see, a lot of questions coming in, so I hope that we get to all of you. Sorry if we don't. So Ryan says, is desiring for more solitude and quietude than I currently have a hindrance or a positive move in the right direction on the path? Yeah, desiring for more solitude is, generally speaking, good. So there are certain desires which we want to cultivate and nourish. Like if we don't have the desire to be virtuous, we're not going to be motivated to change our behavior. If we don't have the desire to meditate, then we're just going to keep doing what we like to do. We're not going to meditate. If we don't have the desire to understand and develop wisdom, we're just going to settle for our meager understanding, our low, normal understanding. So we have to have certain desires for the Dhamma. And then eventually through the practice, we can learn to let go of those. However, just when we're starting out, it's important to have particular desires. And this is a teaching from the Buddha and also from his attendant Ananda. Brahman, he was telling that through desire, we can overcome desire. And a Brahmin said, that doesn't make any sense. And Ananda says, well, it's like if you desire to go to the park. And when you get to the park, then you don't desire to go there anymore because you've already arrived. So in the same way, we desire to make progress on the path. And if we reach the end of the path, then naturally we won't desire to be there anymore because we've reached that if we have. So that's the role of desire. And so desiring seclusion, solitude is important. Otherwise, we won't try to develop solitude. But develop contentment with what you have. So try to find more solitude, but if you can't find enough, just be content. Try to find as much solitude and seclusion as possible, but whatever is not possible, just practice anyway. Practice loving kindness, practice patience, and then if you have the opportunity, you can take advantage of that to be alone. And Ryan says, noises are jarring and annoying. Why are you annoying those poor noises, Ryan? Why are you jarring them and annoying them? They're just noises. They're not bothering anyone. Right? This is the often repeated teaching from Ajahn Chah. Right? The noises don't disturb us, we disturb the noises. So why are we bothering these poor noises? So they're not jarring or annoying. However, if you can find a quiet space, that's also good. It's good to find quiet, but don't disturb the noises. And good evening, Sean. Okay, and then we have a question from Victoria, a practical question. Victoria says, can you talk a bit about what Empty Cloud has planned for Vesaka? Yeah, so for those who don't know, Vesaka Puja, so in the Buddhist or Indian calendar, one of the months is called Vesaka. And Vesaka is also the month we say on the full moon when the Buddha was born, and also, generally speaking, when he attained enlightenment. And in the Theravada tradition, when he passed away. So in the Theravada tradition, all three major events are celebrated on the same day. This is different with different Buddhist traditions, but on the full moon of the month of Vesak, in Theravada Buddhism, generally speaking, celebrate the birth, the enlightenment, and the Mahaparinibbana, the passing away of the Buddha. But in all traditions, I believe the birth is celebrated on this day. So what we plan on doing is on the Sunday, when we normally have a Sunday program, we'll probably do some Dhamma talk on the Buddha's life. We'll do probably some chanting, and we'll do some circumambulation of the Buddha statue, so 3 times, or maybe more than 3 times, circumambulating. And we also will do some meditation, of course. And we might, maybe we'll get a statue of the baby Buddha. And one of the rituals that's often in Asia is you put water over the baby Buddha. So like bathing the baby. So that's maybe if we have a little statue, we can get a little bucket so people can put some water on it. So it's not exactly clear, but it would be nice if we could do some chanting, and we'll probably do some circumambulation. And I believe there will also be a rice pindapata. So we'll just walk outside and people can put rice in the monks' bowls. So things like that. Okay. And then Rebecca has a question. Says, I have heard Mahayana Buddhists say Sanssara is Nirvana. What does that mean? And is there anything that relates to it in the suttas? Okay. Right, coming out with the big questions, Rebecca. Let's see if I can remember right now. It's been a while. Yeah, I think so. There's a famous verse from Nagarjuna. So Nagarjuna was an Indian Buddhist who wrote a very famous treatise called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. So the treatise, the fundamental treatise on the middle way. And what he's talking about is essentially the middle way that the Buddha teaches. He's kind of expanding on the idea of the middle way that the Buddha teaches in the Kachana Gota Sutta. The middle way between a kind of ideas about existence and non-existence. So the details of the sutta I'm not going to go into right now. But anyway, he's expanding on that. And one of the famous verses in there, which I might be butchering it, but I think he says something like, Nirvanasya sangsarat kingchirasti visheshanang. So he says something like, the difference between samsara and nirvana, there's not the slightest little thing that distinguishes them. And then he says the same, between nirvana and samsara, there's not the slightest little detail that distinguishes them. The beginning of nirvana and the beginning of samsara are the same. So anyway, he has a whole kind of treatise on this, a whole section on it. But actually the whole thing is kind of about, it covers the same topic over and over and over again. Like if you ever read the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, he's just repeating himself over and over and over again about the exact same idea, which is essentially that one way of kind of simply saying it, although it's complicated, but one way of simply saying it is that because things are impermanent, and because of the fact of change and impermanence and that things depend on causes and conditions, things don't actually have a stable, independent, lasting nature. So their nature, they don't actually have one. So that's the Buddhist teaching on anatta, the Buddhist teaching on ourself, right? So we don't have a lasting, permanent nature. Because why? Because of change, because of causing and effect, right? Things like this. Well, that is true of everything. That's true of everything in samsara. No thing has a stable nature. So persons are not special. We are conditioned because we're part of the world. So the world is conditioned. That's why we are conditioned. That's why we don't have a kind of permanent, independent, inherent essence or self or unique intrinsic identity to who we are. If that was the case, it wouldn't be possible for us to change drastically, right? So maybe you see a pigeon, and 100,000 lifetimes ago, that was a human. The mind is different, the body's different, the thoughts, emotions, the karma, everything's different. So there's no intrinsic nature. There's no intrinsic part of a self, of a being. But that's true of everything. So what he's saying essentially is that already we're not in samsara because there's no self that's here. There's no intrinsic part of us that's here. And that's true of everything in samsara. There's no abiding essence, which is like stuck in samsara. So it's a little bit of a complicated idea, but it's really not different from what's in the suttas. It's just the way of emphasizing it, the way of talking about it, the way that he explains it is kind of a particular framework, a particular, you could say, lens on the same issues. But it's a kind of way of shocking people to not get stuck. So generally speaking, we have this really strong dichotomy. Like there's the samsara, and then there's some kind of special realm called nirvana. But nirvana is really just, it's a the end of samsara. It's just the relationship between samsara and nirvana. They're not really separable as concepts. Nirvana wouldn't make any sense if there was no samsara, because nirvana is just the ending of samsara. It's nothing else. It's not something extra. So you can't separate them. They have this relationship. And even things in samsara, they don't have an abiding essence. They don't have an abiding nature, especially people, right? That's what we're really concerned about when we're talking about nirvana. We're talking about our liberation. So we're not like abiding in samsara. We don't have this self that's abiding here. So from that perspective, we're already free. But we think that we have this idea like, oh, I am this, I'm stuck in here. But actually, we're already free. So this is something that the Buddha teaches in a different way. He doesn't teach it in this way. But what Nagarjuna is pointing to is the fact that if there was an intrinsic distinction between samsara and nirvana, it would be impossible to escape. If samsara had its own intrinsic separate existence, you could never escape. Right? It's a classic kind of dualism problem. If you have two completely separate substances, then they can't relate to each other. They can't escape or transition between one another. So if samsara was completely separate, if it was some other separate, completely real, independent realm, and nirvana's over here, well, you can never cross that bridge. It's impossible. It's the fact that there is no bridge to cross, the fact that there is no intrinsic abiding substance. That's why nirvana is possible. So it's actually, although it seems shocking, it seems like that can't possibly be true, but it's actually really good news. If samsara had abiding essence, it would be impossible to escape it. So that's all he's saying. He's not saying like, oh, there's no point in liberation. There's no point you should just stay in samsara. You should just, you're already enlightened. That's not what he's saying. He's just simply saying that you shouldn't build this dichotomy in your mind, because what you're doing is you're building this sense of self, which is like, I'm here and I need to go. But what he's saying is you just need to realize that you don't have this self, which is stuck. That's the realization you need to have. You don't need to get yourself out of samsara. You just need to realize that yourself was never in samsara. That's kind of what he's pointing to. So it's a bit of a complicated idea, but it is related to the suttas. It's just the way of speaking about it is different. Okay, and then Evgeny says, any tips for maintaining concentration during walking meditation? Well, one thing you can do is just when you're stepping, it's so simple. When you're stepping, just right, left, or you can even do bud, do, bud, do, bud, do, or any other chanting or word or phrase that helps you. So yeah, sometimes I would recite the name of a Buddha when I was walking on just walking long distance, just walking, just stepping. Another one you can do is metta, 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 metta. So developing loving kindness with every step, like gently stepping, developing loving kindness, gently stepping. So just one word, ideally 2 syllables, that helps your mind step. And then another thing that can help, just one other tip, is that when you do walking meditation, when you reach the end of the path, stop. Take a deep breath and regain your mindfulness, and then turn around and then take a breath and then walk again. Walking. And then you can do again, Buddha, 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 or metta, metta, metta. And then when you reach the end, stop, regain your mindfulness, turn around, gain your mindfulness, form the determination, ideally silently, right? Not moving the mind too much, but just forming the determination to maintain mindfulness as you walk again. So just making those little pauses. Otherwise, you might be walking, and before you know it, you've already worked out all the secrets of mathematics and you haven't been meditating one bit because you haven't been pausing between, right? So we have to make sure that we're taking little moments just to, okay, mindfully again, and then determining to walk mindfully. So those are 2 tips that I find really helpful and that are pretty common. A lot of people find benefit from. So very simple, but also very powerful, just little things that we can do. Okay, Lydia says, I'm an extreme introvert. Now, I don't know if I'm using my practice to avoid social events. Do you have any thoughts that could help me tease out the truth? Well, Lydia, it's very hard to say, honestly. I can't help you tease out in your mind if you are trying to avoid social events. But what I would say is that if you feel like that's probably what you're doing, then probably that is what you're doing. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the thought, right? So if you start feeling like, I feel like I'm trying to avoid social events, well, probably that's what's happening. So you can kind of trust a little bit those intuitions. If it's an intuition about something that you feel you're probably not doing right, generally speaking, you can trust that. If it's an intuition of like how perfect we think we are, then that's probably not trustworthy. But generally speaking, we can trust those intuitions. Sometimes we exaggerate our problems, we exaggerate our faults. That's very common as well. But if it's like an intuition that you're not too sure, I would say you can look into it. But what I'd recommend is just developing metta, developing loving kindness. If we develop loving kindness, then we're good when we're alone, and we're good when we're with others. So metta is always the answer. Like we feel lonely, develop loving kindness. We don't want to socialize, develop loving kindness. It's the same answer for both. When you're with other people, you're frustrated, developing loving kindness. Or you're with other people and you want to go back to your room, develop loving kindness. So all these different things, we can just develop loving kindness. And when you develop it on your own, then when you go out, you'll have more acceptance. Oh, like I'm with all these beautiful sentient beings, all these friends. So then you don't feel like, oh, I hate all these people who are disturbing my practice, but rather you have this feeling of like, oh, look, all these friends. And then when you're alone, you're like, oh, now I can spend more time developing loving kindness for my friends instead of interacting. So loving kindness is always good, especially for emotions around social things, either loneliness or frustration or anger, things like that. It's always good. Kumo says, if one is observing 8 precepts for the Uposatha day, what drinks are allowed after noon? Well, definitely not alcohol. That one is not allowed ever when you're on the 5 precepts. But generally speaking, any drink which is not food is okay. So how do you know if it's food? Well, if you take some fruit and you blend it, you think, well, it's liquid. But right? What you've really done is you've just taken food and you just mashed it into a liquid form. So you just kind of assess, like, is this food or is this a drink? Is this a liquid? So things like tea, herbal infusions, juices, those are fine. But things like smoothies, things like soups which have been blended up, right? Those are foods. Something like broth is a middle way, and broth is allowable in the Vinaya for illnesses. It's allowable for medicine. So if you feel like, you need to warm up, you're getting a cold or you have a sore throat or something, and you want to have something a little bit more medicinal, you can also have a broth. But we distinguish between a broth which is filled with food and just a plain liquid broth, like boiled vegetable broth. Even boiled meat broth is allowable in the Vinaya. So different people, you might be vegetarian and so on, but the broth, if it doesn't have vegetables and so on, that's okay. And other than that, I would say just using common sense, right? So like just seeing like, am I doing this so that I can eat, or am I doing this so that I can drink? Because usually we know, right? If we're having something, what is the intention? Is it to just sneak in food in the form of a liquid? Or is it to just drink what we really is just trying to drink something, right? Just trying to get a liquid. So that's using that common sense of like, is this food that's been ground up or is it liquid? And what's the intention? If you have any more specific questions, though, Kumo, about something in particular, you can feel free to leave it here. Okay, and Ryan says, is stream entry still possible for lay people? Of course. Okay, and Ryan says, should we apologize to people we may have been rude to or have done harm to in our old selves, i.e. our younger years? If you have the opportunity and it's appropriate and you think it's going to be helpful, not harmful, then yes. When we're talking about speech, we want to make sure that when we're speaking, it's true. So, for example, apologizing for something that you know is true, that's good, that's true. We also want to make sure that it's the right time. So, is it the right time for ourselves and also for that person? Is it the right time? We also want to make sure that we say it gently, we say it politely, we say it nicely. So not harshly, rudely, yelling, not cruel, but gently, with a mind of loving kindness. So those are some of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're speaking, right? Speaking true, speaking at the right time, speaking in a way that's gentle and pleasing, speaking with a mind of loving kindness. So those are some of the principles with right speech. So if those are all true, if it's also helpful, beneficial, not harmful. So if you think that by apologizing, it's actually going to help, not harm, not cause more damage, then all those criteria, you can go ahead and do that. If you can't, if for some reason you can't apologize to the person, or it's not really appropriate to apologize to the person, what you can still do is you can repent personally in front of a Buddha statue, or you can tell a spiritual teacher or a spiritual friend. So what you do is you just you can tell a friend, or you can go to a Buddha statue, and you can just bow 3 times, bowing to the Buddha statue, bowing to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, and you acknowledge your mistake, and you acknowledge mentally or verbally, you acknowledge, I made a mistake. It was foolish of me to do that. I did this out of unskillful, and I did this because of unskillful mental states. It was unskillful of me to do, and I commit to restraint in the future. And you sincerely, with a heart of repentance, so a heart that's not beating yourself up with guilt, but a heart that's recognizing that was bad, that was unskillful, and I want to change my mind. I want to turn my mind around. And you sincerely apologize for the act that you've done, as if you were doing it as if the Buddha was physically there. So it's like in your mind, you are training yourself to really sincerely apologize to a significant spiritual figure. Although the Buddha is no longer, he's not there, but we can develop a mind state as if we were repenting, and you can just bow and sincerely repent, and then you can close off. So that's one way of doing it. So just, if you can't actually repent to the person to them directly, then you can also do it like that. And then you can also tell a person, like, I did this, and I did, for example, you can say, oh, I apologized. I did a ceremony to repent. And that actually, it can really help clear the mind. It can really help, because you just kind of accept that you've done that. You accept that whatever consequences that might come from it, you just accept those. That we are the heirs of our karma. So we get the heirs of what we do. So we don't need to run and hide. Right? We don't need to hide under a little roof or hide in a cave. We just say, yeah, I did that. And whatever the consequences are, I accept that I made a mistake, and that I am going to reap the consequences. And when we do that, and when we sincerely repent and we sincerely transform our mind, it's fine. It's actually totally fine. And we understand. It's no problem. So the fear of retribution, it can often come from this inner not accepting what we've done. Not accepting that we've done something and that it has consequences. When we really accept it, and we accept that it has consequences, and we really repent, we realize that we commit to restraint, then we grow, and we move on. And then if retribution does come, we understand it's totally okay. It's natural. And we don't get bogged down in it, because we understand that we've changed. So we know, oh, it's just the past. It's not personal. It's just the past. Like right now, I'm experiencing a human body because of the actions that I did in the past, right? In my past life, I did certain things, and I had certain attachments, and now I'm a human. So I don't need to beat up my past self, like, oh, stupid, you should have been enlightened by then. But rather, I just accept, yeah, I did that, and that's totally fine. I don't need to beat myself up. I just accept. And so then we can do that with anything. And so even in this life, if we've done it in the past, when we experience the future, the results in the present, we just accept, it's not personal. It's just the result of unskillful action. And I've transformed. I've committed to restraint. So I don't need to be afraid of this anymore. I just need to accept the past. Okay, Victoria says, is disappointment still experienced by stream enterers or fully enlightened people? Well, fully enlightened people, so arahants and Buddhas and so on, we wouldn't say that they experience disappointment in the sense of a mental defilement, like frustration, anger. But on the level of like a worldly disappointment, like maybe the Buddha was disappointed that his cousin Devadatta assaulted him, right? Disappointed in the sense of like, oh, it's a shame. Not disappointed in like, or angry or sad or depressed, but just a simple recognition of, oh, that's too bad. But also recognizing that is also nature. Like, given the conditions, It couldn't have been otherwise. So recognizing, I guess we could say like, so sometimes the Buddha makes statements that, for example, that when Venerable Sariputta passes away, he says that it's as if the assembly was empty because someone very dear, because Sariputta was very close to the Buddha. But he also says that he doesn't feel any distress over the passing away of Sariputta. So he recognizes, there's a difference when someone dies. It's not like everything's the exact same. And it's not like, oh yes, let's all celebrate. No, but it's a shame. However, it's nature and there's nothing to be upset about. So maybe like in a very, very, very qualified sense, you could say disappointment, but I'd be hesitant to use that word just because of the connotations that it can have. And in terms of stream enters, stream enters have overcome 3 defilements: Sakaya Ditte, Vicikiccha, and Silabbata Paramasa. So the view of a substantial self, the view of, or you could say wrongly clinging to precepts and rituals, precepts and vows, and doubts about the path, doubts about the Buddha Dhamma Sangha. So even in the suttas, there are stories about stream enterers grieving, for example, at the death of people. So it's possible for even stronger emotions to overpower the mind of someone who's become a stream enterer. However, a lot of the core delusions that they might have about those they would have removed them. So it's not like there's no point in practicing or anything like that. It's just that there's still, for a stream enterer, they still have lots of practice to do. Okay, Joseph says, could you kindly share what this means to you? A learned, noble disciple on a search for renunciation behaves well in 3 ways: by body, speech, and mind. Okay, then you continue. So let's see. The element of renunciation gives rise to perceptions of renunciation. Perceptions of renunciation give rise to thoughts of renunciation. Thoughts of renunciation give rise to enthusiasm for renunciation. Enthusiasm for renunciation gives rise to fervor for renunciation. Fervor for renunciation gives rise to the search for renunciation. So I'll continue reading. It says, suppose a person was to drop a burning torch in a thicket of dry grass. If they were to quickly extinguish it with their hands and feet, the creatures living in the grass and wood wouldn't come to ruin. In the same way, a corrupt perception might arise in an ascetic or Brahmin, and when the body breaks up after death, they can expect to be reborn in a good place. I assume something was skipped here because it doesn't make sense, but I assume if they extinguish it, then they can expect to be reborn in a good place. Okay, so Joseph, just briefly, I might say that what comes to mind here is that essentially when we have the base conditions, then all the effects start following, like dominoes. So if someone has, you say the element of renunciation, well, we might say there is like the potential for renunciation, the fact that we can renounce, that possibility within us, the existence of renunciation in the world, that gives rise to the perception. So we can't perceive something that doesn't exist, right? We can't perceive a unicorn. We can perceive an image of an imaginary unicorn because imaginary unicorns exist as imagination, but they don't exist as reality, as real unicorns, we could say, as physical unicorns. So we can't perceive physical unicorns. We can only perceive imaginary ones. So we can perceive renunciation because renunciation on a base kind of level, it exists. It's something that it exists. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible to perceive it. So because of the existence of renunciation, we can perceive renunciation, like people going forth, people giving things up, or we can perceive in our own mind the perception of how it would be good to let go of things. So when we have that perception, the knowledge, the recognition, you could say, of the fact that renunciation exists, then we think about it. Otherwise, we can't think about it if we don't know it exists, right? And because we think about it, then we start to get enthusiastic, like, oh yeah, that's really great. And we get enthusiastic. So then we start developing a strong push, a strong spiritual striving in that direction, which gives rise to a search for it, like give rise to a search to become a monastic or to become a spiritual renunciant or to be really dedicated to spiritual practice, right? A very dedicated layperson. So it's a domino effect from just the base fact of renunciation all the way down to practicing it. And then in terms of the corrupt perception, the way I take this is that if you get this at the very beginning of the chain, then all the other effects won't happen. So he's saying, like, if a torch falls in dry grass, if you very quickly stomp it out, it won't turn into a whole fire. So if you start having a little bit of a corrupt thing, a little corrupt perception, the perception, if you stomp it out right there, it can't go all the way down to the whole rest of the chain, like a search and a practice of bad things. So if you get the corruption, like, oh, I'm having a bad thought, then you won't go all the way down to pursuing the actions by way of that thought. But if you have a good thought and you let it fall, you'll start pursuing actions in line with that good thought. So we have to catch things early if they're bad, and we have to develop the conditions for things if they're good. That's kind of that's the base teaching that I get out of that. Okay, Mr. has a question, which is not so clear to me. I'm sorry, Mr. He says, what is the ideal that isn't samsara? Is it believed that the Buddha has no body now? Well, the ideal that isn't samsara, I assume what you're saying is like, what are we, what is Nirvana? What are we practicing for? And one simple way of talking about it, just to not get too, not distract the conversation too much, is the Buddha says that Nibbana is the ending of greed, the ending of hatred, and the ending of delusion. So that's Nibbana in a particular sense, the sense of the Nibbana of the defilements, the cause of samsara. So that's the ideal. And then why do we do that? Why do we want to end greed, hatred, and delusion? Because greed, hatred, and delusion are the roots of rebirth. That's the fundamental early Buddhist position. So rebirth is central to the practice. It's central in terms of early Buddhism, because that's the problem. It's kind of like maybe you get a little bit annoyed from time to time. That's like kind of like having an itch. Being reborn is like having cancer. It's much bigger than like a little bit of mental disturbance every now and then. And just a little mental disturbance. If there was no rebirth, it wouldn't be such a big deal, right? We make it, people survive. But rebirth it's really bad. It's very serious. It's grave, and it's beginningless. We can't find a beginning. So it's really a big problem. And so the ideal in early Buddhism is that we want to escape that cycle. So that's the ideal. But that's why we want to end greed, hatred, and delusion, because greed, hatred, and delusion perpetuates our attachment to rebirth. Joseph says, how are you? And the other Venerable, I hope you're all healthy, happy, and well, and have enough requisites. Yes, thank you, Joseph. I'm doing well, and I think that the other Venerables seem to be doing well. So I hope that you're also healthy, happy, and well. Okay, and then Madeline says, I would be very grateful to know what your thoughts are to avoid losing touch with mindfulness in daily activities when life is very busy. Well, one thing that's always good when life is busy is to go back to the basics. Things like mindfulness of our bodily actions and our verbal actions and our ethical intentions. So if we expect to have the mindfulness as if we were on an intensive retreat when we're really actually having a very busy life, we're going to be disappointed. It's going to be a disappointment. We're going to be upset, right? So it's like we expect to climb Mount Everest when actually we just sit on our couch eating potato chips all day. I'm sorry, but we're going to be disappointed when we find out that we can't, right? So it's like our practice on a daily level cannot be so sharply different from our expectations and our goals. So if you're very busy, don't expect your mind to be very calm and peaceful. It's not possible. So yes, it's possible to be busy physically and have a calm mind. It is possible. But realistically, for most people, when we talk about busyness, we often have like emotional busyness as well. It's not just physical. So a lot of times it's a lifestyle change that has to happen. Yes, mindfulness practice is important. Yes, that will help. Yes, that can have a drastic, really sharp, powerful difference in your life. That's very true. However, we just want to make sure that our expectations are realistic with what we're practicing. So I recommend, in order to keep a base level of mindfulness going, if you're mindful of your choices, mindful of your ethical decisions by body, speech, and mind, you will also by extension be mindful of your body and so on, of your surroundings. But you'll be developing a kind of mindfulness which is much more nourishing, much more relatable, much more possible. because we are constantly making decisions. And so we definitely don't want to lose mindfulness when those happen. That's like the one time we really don't want to lose mindfulness. So if you're in the bathroom or you're in the house and you see a cockroach, that's not the time to lose mindfulness and kill it, right? We want to be very mindful to not kill, to be generous, develop a heart of loving kindness. So if we're mindful of what we're doing, like with our choices, then we'll start developing a very important element of mindfulness, which will start nourishing the heart. Because we'll start thinking more about all the beautiful qualities that we develop. When we're speaking, if we start being mindful more of our speech will start being more beautiful. Our speech will start being more true, more creating union and community. It'll start being less harsh. It'll start being more meaningful and useful. So then we'll start feeling better about ourselves. And when we start feeling better about ourselves, we start cultivating more beautiful ethical intentions, then we want to be present. We don't want to be present when our life is a mess and we think that we're making bad decisions and we're not happy with how we're living. If we're happy with how we're living, if we make good, wise, ethical choices by body and by speech, we will want to be present. And we naturally will be present. So then mindfulness will become much more naturally. Because you'll want to be with the person who's there. Like, oh, I want to be with someone who's generous, who's kind, who's loving, who's not violent, who tells the truth, who's not divisive, who uses nice, meaningful speech. I want to be around a person like that. I don't want to be around a person who's grumpy, who's constantly running here and there and doesn't have time for anyone, who's killing or not regarding others well. So we don't want to be around someone like that. So if that person is ourselves, we're just going to want to daydream. We're not going to want to be with that person. So if we're mindful of our actions, we have to be mindful of our body in order to be mindful of our actions. So then we'll already be mindful, and then we'll start developing really the important aspect of mindfulness, which is a condition for a more subtle kind. That's what comes to mind immediately, especially in a busy life. Okay, Scott says, what will the monastics do if the government makes practice impossible? Well, Scott, fortunately, I don't think that is possible, because the practice is something that happens in here, not out here. Yes, conditions are important. So the government can make it more difficult, that's true. But they can't make it impossible, right? That would be really, really sad. So if others could make our own development impossible, we would be doomed. It wouldn't be possible. Most people in the world are not on our side, especially not in terms of spiritual practice. So thankfully, it doesn't depend on the external conditions. It depends on how we relate to those. So even if we are imprisoned, even if we are forced to do things that we wouldn't normally want to do, we can still practice. Might not be able to practice the way we want to, but we can still practice. So that's what we would do. That's what we always want to practice as much as we possibly can, no matter the conditions. So the government can't take that away from us. I remember hearing a story about a Tibetan monastic who was imprisoned or in one of the internment camps because of the political situation going on. And they said that every single day, this is what I remember, I don't remember the details, but they said every single day they lived in fear of getting angry at the people who were torturing them. Right? So not living in fear at the torturing, but at getting angry, because they can't take away that. Only we can take that away. We let ourselves slip. So yes, the Buddha says, even if bandits were to saw you limb from limb, a person who doesn't have loving kindness towards those people is not practicing my teaching. So the Buddha is very strict. Even if bandits were to saw us limb from limb, if we don't have loving kindness, we're not practicing Buddhism. So how much more so if the government says that we have to do something a little bit inconvenient, or they make us do something that's not torturing, not sawing us limb from limb. That's much less than being sawed limb from limb. So unless we're being physically tortured, sawed apart to bits, then we have an easier time than the Buddhist standard. And if we are being physically tortured, still the Buddha says we should have loving kindness. So no one can make us get angry. Only we can do that. We can react with anger. And the same with greed and also delusion. Yes, we can't will it away, but we can practice, and that's always the case. Okay, Ryan has a question, which says, Bhante, have you heard about Mahayana being a schism of the teachings created by Mara? I haven't heard about that, but I've heard some similar things. But I wouldn't listen to that, Ryan. So, what matters is that we practice sila, we practice ethics, we practice samadhi, meditation, we practice wisdom. That's what we're developing. And that's true of all respectable Buddhist traditions, practice those things. So I wouldn't I wouldn't fall for the kind of rhetoric of this a schism created by Mara. Okay. Okay, we have a question from Julie. Hope you're doing well, Julie. Do Theravada monks meet with other types of Buddhist monks, or do they tend to stay together? In which circumstances, i.e. festivals, events, celebrations, or ordinations? And also, have you met the Dalai Lama? Would you like to meet him one day? Well, generally speaking, we tend to stay together just because we have similar precepts and practices. So it's easier to live with people who follow the same precepts and the same type of lifestyle, the same, for example, chanting and so on. So, but it's not that we're closed off. So often we do live with other Buddhist monks of other traditions. Currently, there's a Buddhist monk staying here from another tradition. And also, I have been to monasteries from other traditions, and I really enjoyed my time there, and I learned a lot, and I was very inspired by the monastics practicing. So yeah, it's really beautiful to be around monks of other Buddhist traditions, and also monks of other traditions that aren't Buddhist. Obviously, with Buddhist monks, we have more in common, but being around monks of any kind is always really helpful, really good. So it's just that we tend to stay together just by the simple fact that it's a tradition, so it tends to accumulate people that are within that tradition. True of all Buddhist monks. They tend to be around monks of the same type. But we do definitely socialize, and sometimes we even live together. And then I have not met the Dalai Lama, but would I like to meet him? Yeah, sure. Sure, I'd like to pay respects to him, and it would be nice to meet him. But I'm not sure if I will, just because I am not in the area where the Dalai Lama is, and maybe I'll be there, but I'm not sure. Okay, Kowser Friend says, is Nagarjuna worth studying, or should the suttas be sufficient? Personally, I would recommend that you focus on the suttas, you focus on the baseline of Buddhism. And then if you want to study Nagarjuna, if you want to study other Buddhist teachings, then you do that after you have a foundation in the suttas. So if you read Nagarjuna maybe I should put it the other way, is that if you read Nagarjuna having read the suttas, he makes many, many references all the time to the suttas. So the only sutta that Nagarjuna directly quotes is early Buddha sutta. And then he makes many, many, many references over and over again to things that are in the suttas. He doesn't really directly reference things that aren't. He makes he makes certain allusions to like the Prajnaparamita sutras, but really he's really talking about ideas from the suttas. Because Nagarjuna was talking to Buddhists who took the suttas as authoritative, the suttas in the Abhidharma. So he wasn't talking to really people who agreed with him. Otherwise, what's the point, right? We'd just be saying the same thing over and over to each other. So the whole point is that he's talking to people who really, they're based on the suttas in the Abhidharma. So yeah, if you read the suttas first, and you make that the base of your practice, and then if you decide to study Nagarjuna. But personally, I wouldn't say you have to. I wouldn't say like, oh, you must. If that was true, then the Buddha wouldn't be the supreme teacher. So the Buddha is the best teacher. Nagarjuna was just a monk, very respectable, very wise monk, but he wasn't the Buddha. So we want to put the Buddha first, and then other teachers we can learn from those people, just as we learn from modern teachers. I mean, I wish I was as wise as Nagarjuna. So the fact that you're listening to me means that clearly we listen to people other than the suttas, right? So it's totally fine to listen to other teachers. We do that all the time. We have conversations with people all the time who are not the Buddha. But it's just putting our priorities straight, right? Okay, Rick says, the last few years, my chronic illness has gotten worse. How do I determine what are real medical needs of the 4 requisites versus creating too much clinging toward having particular conditions? Well, Rick, what I would say comes to mind immediately is really just developing that loving kindness and compassion towards both yourself and also the illness. Because it's easy to get strict on ourselves when we're suffering and just in our practice. But if we have loving kindness and we have compassion towards ourselves and also towards the illness and so on, I'm not sure the specific nature of the chronic illness that you're experiencing, but if we have that kind of loving compassion, then usually we'll know what to do. We'll know what's right. Right? If we have anger and frustration, then our mind will be confused. It'll be cloudy. But if we have love, kindness, and acceptance, then our mind will be more clear and it will know how to act compassionately. So compassionate action comes from compassion. It doesn't come from anger. So if we want to have compassionate action towards ourselves, the ideal nurses, the ideal doctors, the ideal doctor doesn't help because they want money, because they're greedy, or because they want to feel superior to other doctors. No, the ideal doctor acts out of compassion because they want to help. So if we want to be the ideal doctor for ourselves, the best doctor that we can possibly be, we should develop compassion for ourselves and our illness. So sometimes people use language like battling cancer. Well, why do you want to be battling? Right? What is this battle? So kindness and compassion is the way, not battling. And that's true of any illness. And this is even in secular environments, in secular contexts, they use things like mindfulness and acceptance in order to help patients with chronic pain, right? Why? Because anger, frustration, and battling chronic pain makes it worse. You don't need to be Buddhist to think that. It's just a fact of life. That's why people use mindfulness in order to help chronic pain. Because acceptance and love, they help ease pain. Right? When we're sick and someone who loves us helps take care of us, we feel better. So we can always love and take care of ourselves in that way. So it'll help us feel better. And then when we act, we'll act out of compassion. So then you might think like, oh, am I just clean? But if you have compassion, you'll start to feel better. You'll have a clearer mind. You'll start to see, actually, I really need this. Or actually, I'm okay just how I am. This is okay. I'm okay with my condition. I can develop love towards this condition. That's okay. So compassion will give you that clarity. It'll give you the contentment to be better in yourself, and also give you the clarity not to be too harsh when you really need help. That's what comes to mind to me. Okay, and then Kumo, we're almost to the end. So Kumo says, what is the advice if a person has a health issue and some amount of caloric intake more than broth or tea is necessary to maintain a healthy body for the not eating afternoon precept? Well, generally speaking, in a lot of Theravada monasteries, there are certain tonics which are allowed, which are taken in the evening. Like for example, ghee and dark chocolate and so on. So there's certain tonics that are taken in the evening. And so if you feel that you need some extra calories, then you can, if you have contact with a monastery, I would recommend just following the customs that you're familiar with. Because the details of that can be just too much to go into the details of like how do you decide what's allowable. But generally speaking, the basic principle that the Buddha gave was that things be not considered solid food, so not considered substantial food. However, that they would be helpful in the case of someone who needs a little bit of calories. So like a basic example is, like I said, ghee. So if you try to eat a bucket of ghee, it's not going to feel good. You can't have a meal of just ghee. However, ghee has calories, which will help you if you need a little bit of extra boost. Right? They have some fats, and it helps kind of give you a little bit of boost. Also things like butter, and so things like also often dark chocolate is very common. You can't have a meal of dark chocolate. And also a lot of people don't, it's just, it's more of like, it gives you a little bit of a boost. Also things like juice gives you some calories. So things like that are relatively common and relatively widely accepted, those you can take if you feel. And then also the other thing though, I would say is, if it's only one day, if you're a layperson, I recommend minimizing as much as possible. Like if you're living on the 8 precepts, then that's when you can have health problems if you don't have sufficient nutrition. However, if it's just a single day, then I recommend being a little bit stricter because it makes it, that's why you're doing it. You're doing it in order to practice fasting. So it's like, well, I'm going to follow the 8 precepts and I'm going to have a turkey dinner because I need some calories. It's like, well, you might as well just not take the precept then. So it's totally fine to have dinner. You're not going to hell or anything. So it's just, if you want to have dinner, I would say have it. And if you can't really healthily have a day without dinner, it's totally fine. Just have dinner if you need it for your body. If you don't need it, then I'd recommend really just not having it, like kind of doing one or the other type of thing. Otherwise, a half is less. But there are certain tonics that you can take. If just a little bit of a boost, if that's enough, then that's okay. Yeah, just a little boost. But if you need to have like a more substantial meal to really have enough calories, that like not a little bit, but a calorie of a kind of whole meal, then there's not really the allowance for that just by Vinaya itself. Okay, and then we have, looks like one more question currently, who says, may I ask how you chose to ordain where you did? What were the factors you considered? Personally, for me, one of the main factors was being in a monastery where the suttas, so the early teachings of the Buddha, were valued as a kind of priority. Because there's a lot of communities which are full of really great practitioners and very dedicated practitioners, where maybe the words of the particular teacher is kind of the priority. And for some people that works, but for me personally, I was more interested in having the Buddha as the teacher. Like I became, we call ourselves Sakyaputta, son of the Sakyan, son of the Buddha. That's what a monk, that's who we are, sons of the Buddha. So the particular teacher might change. And we don't know with teachers who, you can never know with a living person the state of their mind. However, it's foundational to the entire Buddhist tradition that the Buddha was the Buddha. That's what Buddha means, enlightened. So the Buddhist teachings are based off of someone who had an insight. And that person who had an insight, we recite almost every single day, sometimes twice a day, sometimes more than twice a day. Anuttaro Purisa Dhammasarati, the unsurpassed teacher of people who can be tamed, the unsurpassed tamer. So if he's unsurpassed, then why would we settle for someone who is surpassed by him if we have access to his teachings? So we don't have access to the living Buddha in that sense. But for me, the suttas are very important. They're very important because that's the base of every Buddhist tradition. It's the base of what the Buddha taught. It's something that really gets to the heart of the practice. And if the Buddha is really the supreme teacher, then the closest we can get to the direct teachings of him, those would be the most relevant. That would be what we'd really want to look to first. And then, yes, we can learn from other people. We can learn from living teachers. We can learn from living traditions and other traditions. But for me, that was very important because I wanted the Buddha to have kind of, you could say, the final say, right? Although we can't expect perfection from a text, but we can. It's closer than, say, putting those beneath something else. So for me, that was kind of the main factor, because I felt that when you have that element in common, then everything else can kind of follow. But if you have that beginning element in common, like if at the very base you don't have the same agreement about where are you getting your inspiration from, where are you getting the core of the teachings from, if you don't agree with that in a community, then it's hard to have everything else follow, right? So for me, that was personally important. Okay, and that's the last question online. So before we close, is there anything pressing here in person? No? Okay. So we can close and say 3 sadhus just to the being here and practicing together and doing this meritorious deed together. We can say 3 sadhus to close up. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I hope you all have a wonderful night and a wonderful week and a good rest of your practice.